Hey, this week I want to talk about how I create my decals for my pedal enclosures. So when it comes to building your pedals at home, the circuit board is only part of the project. Another big part that a lot of the times gets glossed over is how you add graphics to your pedal enclosure. I get this question a lot from anybody who sees my pedals. That's because my pedals kind of look a little bit more professionally done, but I promise you it's done on the cheap. For some people, adding graphics is as simple as doing their own paint job with, toll paints or something along that lines. Other folks will even go really simplistic and just use a black magic marker to label their tone, volume, gain. For me, like I said, I like to use something a little bit more professional looking. So what I do is use a piece of software on my computer to generate my graphic, and then I have a method for transferring that graphic from a printed out piece on an inkjet printer to my pedal enclosure. So with that, let's take a look at the software that I use to create my pedal graphics. So when creating decals for your enclosure, you have lots of different software options. This can range anywhere for something like Microsoft Paint, all the way up to applications that you're paying for monthly like Adobe Photoshop. Myself, I like to use an application called Paint.net. It functions very similar to Microsoft Paint, but it allows you to create layers within your project. If you want to get Paint.net, it's free to use, and all you have to do is open up a web browser, type in www.getpaint.net, and it'll bring you to their homepage. The current version is shown on the right. In this case, it's Paint.net 4.1.4. I believe I'm on this version. Paint.net is really good in that it prompts you to upgrade each time an upgrade is available. This is done when you close the application. So as long as you're saying okay to those upgrades, your application will stay as recent as possible. When you open Paint.net, you're going to be given a blank canvas. The first thing you're going to want to do is ensure that the resolution of this canvas and the dimensions of it are correct. In my case, I'm doing a 1590 BB enclosure in this example, and it's going to be in the portrait orientation. So the first thing I want to do is go Image and Canvas Size and set my resolution. So for any decals, I would recommend a resolution of at least 300 pixels per square inch. Anything lower than that is going to be a little bit blocky when you print it off. If you're 300 or above, you should be good and everything should be crisp and clear. For the 1590 BB enclosure in portrait, I want to set the width of my project to 3.48 inches and the height to 4.45 inches. I'll also put the values for a 1590A and a 1590B in the description below. In both cases, you're going to use the 300 pixel per square inch resolution, but the width and height are going to change. So once you've adjusted your canvas size and resolution, you're going to see just a white layer, which is by default named background. I think of this as the color of my enclosure. It's not a transparent layer, it's white in this case. If I did want to see what my decal would look like, say, on a green enclosure, I could simply choose the paint bucket and change the color of my background. For this instance, though, I'm just going to stick with a white background. After my background is checked out and I've set my color, the next thing I want to do is create a border line just to kind of give me an idea of where I want to stay within. Now, you don't necessarily need this, but I find it's also really good for hiding the edges of the decal when it's actually stuck onto the enclosure. So in this case, I just use a shape, and it is a rounded rectangle. I keep my brush width at about 4, and I use the color black. And if I start up in the upper left-hand corner, somewhere close to a square, which is about here, and it doesn't need to be exact, but you want to try to get it as close as you can. In this case now, I've selected my shape as a filled shape. I just want the outline, so up here I will select draw shape outline instead of filled shape with outline or just shape. So now I have my border. Once I have my border, the next thing I want to do is add my drilling template. In this case, what I do is look to any documentation I might have on drilling templates, if I've used something in the past or if one is provided with a specific build I'm doing. In this case, the build I'm doing, I do have a enclosure drilling template that's shown here. It's from Pedal PCB. And what I use to copy this out is something called snipping tool, which is built into every Windows 10. And if I just say I want a new snipping tool, and I try to get as close to the face of that enclosure as possible, and I outline the drilling template. Again, it doesn't have to be exact. I get a quick copy of it with snipping tool, and then bring it back into my paint.net, add an extra layer, and paste it inside. Now at this point, the drilling template that was provided is obviously at a smaller resolution, and it's not the same size as my canvas, so I'll just click and drag that to expand it to the exact size of my canvas, which is about there. And I'm also going to go ahead and label these layers on the right so they're easy to follow. I have my border here, and I'm going to call this drilling template 1. Now there's a couple issues with using this drilling template here. First off is it's not a transparent background, so I'm not going to be able to print it off without seeing all this gray border, etc. So what I like to do in this case is add another template over top of it, or another layer over top of it. We'll call this drilling template 2. And here I'm just going to use the transparent background on drilling template 2 and add these dots here. So for that, I'll just go back to my shapes. I'll select a circle. This time I want to use a draw filled shape. Make sure it's black, and go ahead and draw my drilling holes. You can then copy these using just Control V and Control C and move them to all the other locations on the enclosure face. So I'm just doing this quick, so nothing's exact. If you want all of these in line with each other, of course you can copy and paste them and use your arrow keys to get them a little bit closer in line, but I'm just eyeballing it for this example. So at this time I now have a secondary drilling template layer. I want to shut off my first layer here to show you what that will look like now. And you can see I have my drilling template over top of my border and my background. At this point, I don't need this initial drilling template, so I can delete that layer using the red X button here. And I'll just rename this to drilling template. So at this point, I want to switch over to a Enclosure Deckle that I've already created. It has the same drilling template, so everything should be pretty much in line. One thing I did change on this one is I've combined my background and bordered layers. It's just something I always do, or I do most often, just because most of my enclosures are white or I paint them white, so I don't need to separate out those two layers. This one also has my Punye logo in it. Once I've finished with my drilling template, I want to check to see how my parts are going to lay out inside my enclosure. So I've created outlines for potentiometers and also created some crosses that I can put over switches just to make sure that nothing's going to run into each other. In this case, I like the location of all the potentiometers. I don't see that anything's going to run into it. I do have some spots here that show for LEDs. There's going to be no bezel on those LEDs when I create it, so I think I'm good to go here. At this point, I can turn off my parts layer because everything's checked out. After I've finished with my parts layer, I'm going to move on to my text layer. And again, I'll say that it's really good to use as many layers as you can. It just makes it a lot easier if you have changes down the road. If you don't like a font or if you don't like a graphic, you can just focus on that one layer as opposed to having everything on a single layer. In this case, my text is for the JHS VCR, which is a board done by Pedal PCB called the VHS. So I have a volume, chorus, and reverb label. I also have my out and in labels, and this is going to be a true bypass pedal, so I've added true bypass. In the past, I've also added labels for my DC input just to let people know what the polarity will be, but all my pedals are done with the same polarity, so I'm not worried about it here. If you want to add text, the easiest way to do it is just click on the text button. You can choose your font and the size of the font at the top, as well as colors down on the right, make them bold, italic, underline, etc. So after you've done your text, you want to go ahead and do your graphics. In my case, I usually have an image that I want to put on it or some colorful text. In this case, I'm just going to do some simple colored rectangles at the top and at the bottom. And because this is kind of a play on VCR, VHS, I've also added a secondary graphic that I like to call Betamax, which just harks to the VHS VCR pun. At this point, I would consider my decal completed. So what I would like to do is print this off on just a plain piece of paper, ensuring that the scaling is at exactly 100% so I don't lose any of the resolution or width and height that I've set my page up to be. Since I'm printing it to a plain piece of paper, I can use it as a drilling template, or if I've already got an enclosure drilled out, I can use it to ensure all my holes are going to line up with my decal. Once I'm satisfied with the decal and the plain piece of paper, I'll go ahead and print this on either a water slide or a clear label page. I hope you guys liked that tutorial of paint.net. It really is a powerful tool that really goes a long way in creating your graphics and providing that professional look. As I said before, whenever I'm done with paint.net, I always print out my graphic on a plain piece of white paper. And that's just used to either act as a drilling template, as you can see here, or in other cases to make sure that my decal is going to line up with my enclosure holes if I've already pre-drilled it. Once I'm done with the white piece of paper, I've got to get something that is transparent that I can print this graphic onto, that I can lay onto my enclosure. For this, you have a couple of options. One would be water slide decals. These are a little bit on the expensive side for me. You know, they work really well. I've tried them a couple times, but I find that, you know, $25 for 10 sheets is a little bit expensive. I also have to order them online, and with shipping here in Canada, I end up waiting a while for them. So I've actually found an alternative, and I've noticed a few other folks on YouTube are using the same way, so I think I'm onto the right path, and that is these Avery 7665 shipping labels. So this is a full 8.5 by 11 sheet, clear, transparent, and it works with inkjet and laser printers. I have an inkjet printer. I know a lot of people say laser's the best way to go, but I've never really had an issue with inkjet printers. as long as I let the ink dry on the decal before I press it onto my enclosure. And that is really just a really important thing to say. This is a finished version of my printouts. Make sure to print them all with the best resolution of your printer. I try to stick as many onto one of these 8.5 and 11 sheets as possible, just so I'm not wasting any of these clear labels. And yeah, like I said, you want to let these sit for at least a day, if not two, just to make sure the ink dries. I've tried it before, just letting it sit for even 6 hours, and I've got smudges in the ink when I've pressed it onto my enclosure. After I've got the transparent label pressed onto my enclosure, I'm pretty much done. Of course, you're going to need to use a scalpel and cut out all the holes where your components are going to poke through. And the other major thing for me is to actually put a coat of clear coat over your decal, just so none of your foot stomping is going to smudge that ink anytime soon. This is just a Rust-Oleum. It works with plastic and all kinds of other things. It's clear gloss, so I found it's really good. I've got a couple pedals that are maybe 2 or 3 years old and nothing's yellowed on them before, so I'm really big fan of this stuff. You only need maybe 2 coats. I wouldn't really put any more than that on it. You could probably even get away with 1. You just don't want your first couple times when you're stepping on your pedal, if you miss the foot switch or whatever it may be, that you're scratching up a newly minted pedal, we'll say. So I hope you guys liked that tutorial on how I create my pedal enclosure graphics. If you guys have any questions, definitely hit me up in the comments below. Other than that, subscribe, comment, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.